Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Soul Creativity. Naven here. Today's guest is Stacey Couch, and you may remember Stacey from a previous episode on Soul Creativity. Stacey was here for episode number 26, and we had a great conversation. So if you missed that one, be sure to go back and catch it later. And also, I want to mention that the live chat is up. So post a comment or question, and we will get to it during our discussion today. So, welcome back, Stacey, and thank you so much for joining me again. Your material is so fascinating that I just couldn't wait to talk with you again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Naven. Yeah.
And I'm sure everyone saw from the description under the video. So if you're looking for Stacey's website or mine or contact information, look under the video. But you've probably noticed that we're going to talk about fairy tales and soul wisdom today. So that's a really interesting topic, I think, Stacey. And so I'm anxious to dive into it. I wonder, for opening, if you can tell us why do you think fairy tales are useful guides for spiritual wisdom or spiritual seekers?
Yeah. Well, one of the big reasons is because they are archetypal. There are universal messages or symbols. Archetypes are simply symbols. So there's these universal symbols that are in fairy tales that speak to the ancient parts of ourselves. These are, because I think so often we think when we're talking to the soul, we're working with the soul or soul language, we tend to want to use words. But the soul actually works mostly in the language of images and symbols. So fairy tales have these images and symbols, and then they are embedded in these stories that are ancient, these stories that really speak to us on a deep level that we might not even recognize at first, and speak to the human condition and experiences, struggles that we have, and also things that we are striving for, places where we would like to go and people we would like to be.
I like that you said that symbols, like symbols or metaphors, are the language of the soul
Yeah.
and the language of the universe.
Yeah.
And so it's really nice to get us out of that sort of logical and linear way of looking at things and sort of change our perspective. And it can lead us into noticing the symbols and signs that come up just every day in our lives. I
Exactly.
think it keeps it in our brain that there are other ways to look at things. Uh, Based on that, is there like a particular or a specific fairy tale you can tell us about and the guidance it offers us?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. And just you talking too, before I move to that, one of the pieces that I'm thinking about too is this idea of dreams. Like our soul speaks to us in dreams, right? So fairy tales are collective dreams, are dreams of humanity. And I've had a number of occasions where people will have a dream and I'll say, have you heard of this fairy tale or this folk tale before? And they'll say, well, I've heard of it, but I don't know what the story is. And I'll tell them the story and it'll be almost exactly their dream. So that's the other piece of it too. It's like the fairy tales are these collective dreams that humanity has been having over the centuries. So the fairy tale, yeah, I think that would be a good example to take a look at, that most people are familiar with, is the story of Sleeping Beauty. That's the name that Charles Perrault gave to the story. The Brothers Grimm worked a different story, a little bit different telling, called Little Briar Rose. And that's actually the one I'm going to go with because it takes out the layer of Prince Charming and all of that that's in the Charles Perrault story and brings in some extra symbols that I think are really helpful. So if it's all right with you, I'll give just a brief summary of the story because I think people know the kind of high level of what happens in Sleeping Beauty, but there's a couple details I'd like to make sure people know before we dive in looking at what those mean. Yeah.
That would be great.
Okay. Yeah. So the story starts out with a couple, king and queen, that are wishing for a child and not getting one, until finally they are blessed with a baby girl. And she's beautiful and they're delighted and super happy. So they hold a party and they invite everyone. And for some reason, they only have 12 golden plates, and they need these golden plates for each of the wise women they want to invite. And there's 13 wise women, 12 plates. So they only invite 12 of the wise women to come. And of course, they want them to come because the wise women are those, the women who bless the baby. So the 12 wise women come and they start to go through blessings, good fortune, beauty, love, happiness, all of these beautiful blessings on the baby girl. And then in bursts the 13th wise woman. And she's furious that she's been scorned and not invited to the party. So she curses the baby girl and says when she turns 15, she will die. Luckily, the 12th wise woman hadn't gotten a chance to bless the baby yet. She couldn't undo the curse, but she could modify it. And so she modified the curse to be 100 years of sleep. And the curse was that the sleep would come on her 15th birthday when she poked her finger with a spindle. And so the father thought, okay, well, I can prevent this. I'm a king. I have authority over everything. I'll take all the spindles out of the kingdom and then she'll be safe. And so he did as much. He collected all of the spinning spindles. Spindles are what you use for spinning yarn, and put them all in a pile and burned them. And then they went on about their lives. And little Briar Rose's 15th birthday came. Someone was asleep at the wheel because both of her parents were gone. I don't know if they were off planning her 15th birthday party or what was going on, but she had time to herself the morning of her 15th birthday and went wandering around the castle board trying to find something interesting. She wandered up into the tower of the castle and found a door, locked door, with a key in the lock. And out of curiosity, turned the key, the door bursts open, and she finds an old woman sitting and spinning yarn. She goes over, very interested in this whole process because she's never seen anything like it before, since all of the spindles have been kept away from her. And she picks up the spindle, and what do you know, pricks her finger, a drop of blood comes out, she falls asleep. She falls asleep, and everyone else around the castle falls asleep as well. And then what happens is this thorny hedge grows up and grows thick around the whole castle. So it becomes this impenetrable wall. Nobody can get in. And their legend about little Briar Rose and her long sleep spreads throughout the rest of the countryside. And occasionally some bold young man who thinks he's better than everyone else tries to get through the thorny hedge and can't make it. And the more gruesome stories, have him being kind of each of them being consumed or killed off by the thorny hedge. Finally, 100 years comes around, and there is a certain young man who hears the legend and decides he's going to try. He comes to the hedge and at just the right time. So this has something to do with divine timing too, doesn't it? He gets there and the hedge opens up and the thorns turn into roses. There's beautiful roses everywhere. He enters into the castle grounds, sees everyone asleep, keeps wandering through the castle looking for this beautiful princess that he's heard about. Eventually makes it up to the top of the tower where she's asleep and finds her, gives her that magical kiss, and she wakes up.
Very, very interesting. And as you were telling the story, I was like imaging in my mind all of the versions of Sleeping Beauty that I've seen or read about over the years. So we can see there's a lot of, I'm thinking archetypes and symbols within that story. But how do you figure out the soul's perspective on a fairy tale such as?
Yeah, so one of the things is, like you talked about, reading different versions of it can be really helpful. Yeah, and when I read those different versions, then the symbols that I see, the images, the items that keep showing up over and over again, no matter if you're reading a story from France, you're reading a story from the Arabian Nights, there's long sleeps in that story. If you're reading, reading stories from different places, you'll see certain images that are certain symbols that repeat. In this story, the three, I mean, I could easily find 10 symbols to work with. And of course we have the archetypes of the people as well. But the three that I'd like to look at with you, Naven, is to look at the spindle itself. Also the metaphor of the long sleep. And then, because that shows up in a lot of different stories, and then the metaphor of this hedge of thorns and roses, those three images. The spindle, I've been fascinated by this. I'm actually think I'm just going to buy a spindle and just have it on my altar, because it's such a strong symbol in fairy tales. And yeah, and I've been watching YouTube videos like, how does this thing work? Because it shows up in Rumpelstiltskin and many different versions of Rumpelstiltskin. There's a lot of fairy tales where the spindle shows up. And for people that don't know what it is, it's a long stick, essentially, with, doesn't always, but in the fairy tales it always does. They have really sharp ends because they need to spin. So what you do is you hold a spindle up like this, and you set it spinning in a bowl. The point sits in a bowl. You set it spinning in a bowl, and then you've got wool that you're feeding onto that spindle. So it's spinning the yarn. It's spinning the yarn, and then you're wrapping the yarn around that spindle. So it's how you make. It's a really rudimentary and ancient way of making yarn. Yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah. And so this spindle brings us to the spinstress, right? An old term, the old maid, right? Here's an archetype that I've also been really researching, because she shows up very predominantly in a lot of different stories. This idea of this old woman that's spinning yarn her whole life. So we could see it, we talk about spinning yarns or spinning stories, right? But we can also see it as this sitting still and spinning, but not really ever getting anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be problematic as well, as if you have an idea or something you're interested in bringing out into the world, but you're afraid to bring your gift or speaks to you out into the world, then you just sit there and kind of spin and think about it and make stories up about what you do with it, but you don't actually ever take it anywhere. And so I think, the little briar rose meeting this spinstress and poking herself with the spindle is one way to look at it, is her kind of falling under that spell of, I can't go out and be creative in the world with the gifts I have. Like, it's not safe. And so I'm just going to sit here in this tower, in this closed space, and keep it inside and relegate it into the unconscious or into the deep sleep.
As you were talking about that one, to interrupt you for a second, Stacey, is also in a particular story, but I think, in other ones too, the spinstress is locked away as well. Just like you said, she found her in a room where she hadn't, seen her before. And so it's making me also think, not only is someone not acting on their creativity or their gifts and they're afraid, but that removes us in a way from, maybe the community or everyday activities, we're kind of, I'm wondering if it stops us not just from bringing forth our own creative gifts, but, removing ourselves from daily life in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So, and one of the ways I work with fairy tales from the perspective of the soul too, is to really look at everything within the fairy tale as something we have within us. So the king and the queen kind of falling asleep on the job. I mean, it's her 15th birthday. Like, this is the moment of potential problem. And they've just gone into kind of the state of denial or their own unconscious state. Right. And so it speaks to not being on guard, and how we, even when we know, even when we're warned about the problems with denial, being in denial, or falling asleep, being unconscious, right? That's a big thing we talk about in the spiritual circles that we travel in, even though we're warned against it, it still happens. We still drop our guard down and forget, and we're still kind of bitten by that. I think about that spindle poking her as well as like kind of being bitten by the sleep, like the unconsciousness takes her over where she can't, it's not something that she can avoid. And we like to try and think we're going to reach consciousness and stay there. And it's not true. Like we always, something happens where we fall into this kind of complacency, and we can go years or even decades. I mean, I talk to a lot of people that reach certain points in their life, midlife or retirement, and they're like, what have I done with my whole life? Like, I really wish I would have done something big, or now I have these ideas of what I want to do big and I have so little time left. And this is all speaking to that sleep, that no matter how hard we try, it's just part of what happens in life, where we go unconscious to our interior, into what we're driven to do in our creative selves. And so that's how that sleep plays into it as well.
Right. And so what about the thorn, or the
yeah,
what kind of brings you out of, I'm thinking about what brings us back out or wakes us up to.
yeah. Well, and that's the thing. There's always this set period of time. Like we have the story of Rip Van Winkle. There always seems to be like this set amount of time that we just have to be asleep. And so we tend to view sleep as a negative thing. Like, oh, you're unconscious. You're not conscious to what you're doing. You're not aware, alert, awake. And there also, we have to remember, is a benefit to sleep, because it's an incubation. There is a lot going on when we are asleep at night. We are having dreams. We are working. Our soul is helping us work things out through the subconscious images in our dreams. The sleep is not a void. The sleep is actually a very rich or fruitful time where there are things growing or being nurtured within that are happening on their own time and by their own nature. And so I think that's important to remember too. I've seen interpretations of the story. One way to look at it in a really kind of broad scope is to step back and look at it as a metaphor for the cycles of the seasons as well. So the sleep being the long winter. So that's another way to look at it. Thorns are an interesting one. You know, when I started digging into this idea of thorns, we talk about having a thorn in our side, right? And then we look at, I'm going to go, kind of biblical here, but we look at Jesus's crown of thorns. And that crown of thorns often is representative of shame or of a sinful nature. And so you look at here ourselves. Here we've been, we have an awareness of our own creativity or something about ourselves, but we see that it doesn't fit in with what society tells us we should do. And so we put that part of ourselves to sleep. One way to describe it would be, when I was very young, I really wanted to be an artist. Like, people ask me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I said, an artist. And one of my parents' responses to that was, well, you're not going to make any money doing that. Right? So boom, that part of me fell asleep in the tower. And then there was a shame around that desire. There was a shame around that gift. Thus the thorns, both kind of protecting it, but also kind of digging into it as this reminder of what's missing. The thorns also show up with the Greek god Eros. He was in a garden of roses and went to grab a rose, and a bee stung him, and he got angry about it, like got mad at the flowers that he got stung. And that stinging moment reminds me of little briar roses getting poked with the spindle, right? And so he gets stung, and then he gets angry, and he shoots his arrows into the patch of roses. And that's the story of how roses got their thorns. So it's the love scorned. It's the passion scorned, because the Greek god Eros is like the embodiment. He's Cupid, right? The embodiment of love. So when our loves, our passions are scorned, then we get thorny, we get kind of cranky about it, right? That's another way of understanding it. And we keep people out. We're also looking to protect those things that people judge. We're trying to keep them safe from the world through that thorny hedge. Yeah. But everything has its divine timing. So you say, how can we wake ourselves up? Everybody's like, how can I get that prince in? Like, how can I get him through? And it's all about timing. It's about gestation. Just like you can't bring that baby out through labor any earlier than that baby wants to come. It's the same way with this. It's all on divine timing, and it's when it's ripe and it's ready to come out. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's one of the more difficult things for us to accept if we're trying to bring something new or, one of our creations to the surface. It can be frustrating because, patience isn't always our strong point. But I really always like talking about divine timing because that's played a role in my own life. And there can also be some guilt that goes along with that. If other people are progressing in such a way, but your own story may not, your own fairy tale may not, bring you to that point as quick as you like. And so you can start to feel like there's something, wrong with you that you're not seeing it take place. So I'm always interested in that. I want to remind anyone listening in live that, feel free to post a comment or a question, and Stacey and I will get to it. This might be in a slightly different direction, Stacey, but I'm wondering, because this is important to me, and I know to you and other listeners, is what about the feminist viewpoint that criticizes fairy tales for their depictions of the, distressed damsel and being rescued by the gallant knight?
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of criticism out there. There's a lot. So I think the feminist retellings of these stories are really brilliant. Angela Carter is one of my favorite feminists, authors who's done some brilliant retellings of fairy tales and from a feminist point of view. And so they'll rewrite the endings. They'll, they change all sorts of different things. And I think this is helpful in that it causes us to pause and question, gender norms and ways that misogyny or the patriarchy are reflected in these stories. I think all of that is really important. I came across a piece, a description. I haven't actually seen the piece of art in person, but a description in a picture of called The Daughter, of Little Red Riding Hood's daughter, and it was half wolf, half human. It's like, it's really challenging, these things, but it causes us to stop and question, like what are we, because when you read these fairy tales, because a lot of them, the versions that we are left with right now are from a very patriarchal time. And so when we read them, literally, we do read them as, here is this girl, Sleeping Beauty, she's trapped, Prince Charming is coming along to save her. And we can really get, run into a lot of issues in terms of the feminist approach. And so I like to know the feminist retellings and honor that, while at the same time, how can we work with these from a neutral perspective, from the soul's perspective, where we all have masculine and feminine within us. So this isn't a story about me as the damsel in distress in the tower waiting for some prince to come save me. No. This is about the feminine part of me that's gone to sleep, and the masculine part of me that's out in the world being active, but yearning to connect. The two aspects of me, the day aspect of me and the nighttime aspect of me, so it's looking at it from that perspective, where it really, in a way, strips gender out, because we realize that it's not about me as a woman and someone as a man. It's about the feminine and masculine principles working within. So that's one piece of it. And I'm looking at my notes too, because There are also a lot, like the most popular fairy tales, thank you, Disney, are the ones of the damsel in distress. But when we look at the whole spectrum of fairy tales available, there's just as many fairy tales of women saving girls, women, young women saving their brothers, saving their loves. Those are just as common. So I think that's the other way to approach it is, okay, what stories can I find where there's the heroine in the story who's really helping the helpless men through. And this one's a tricky, the little Briar Rose is a tricky one because there's definitely question of consent going on here. Yes, the hedge opens for him to allow him in, but then he goes and kisses this princess who's asleep. She hasn't consented to this advance from him.
Right.
And I think that is an interesting question because that brings up, in us the times when we haven't given consent and something has happened to us. And that is a trauma in the soul to work with as well. And how do we respond to that? So I think it's both worth looking at it from a feminist perspective and addressing the trauma and the issues that come up in these stories, and then also stepping back and viewing it from a larger neutral perspective.
Yeah, it seems like just looking at it on a bigger, big picture scene rather than just, the narrow one view, though I understand the criticism and, the importance of exposing children to, both.
Yeah.
Maybe
And it opens up a conversation too.
Right.
I mean, you can open up conversation with your child if you're telling them a story like, how do you think the princess felt when she woke up and some guy was hovering over her that she'd never met before, right? So it can open up conversations like that. Yeah, and I've been playing, since I have a 4-year-old son, I've been kind of playing around with fairy tales for kids and how to approach telling him stories. So many stories people fall asleep, and it's absolutely a metaphor for death. It's a metaphor for death of the self and then a resurrection of the self. And my son, he always gets excited when we get to the point of the story where I'm like, you know what happened? And then and he says, fell asleep. Like, it's so fun, and there's some stories where the characters do die. And instead I just say they fell asleep. Right. So we have these ways we kind of soften them for our kids until they're ready to kind of handle the harsher truths. But they can feel the harsher truths in there too. And then for us as adults, like, these the fairy tales aspect so trivialize it that it's only for kids, where these are folk tales, these are mythology, these are our heritage that we have to work with, the wisdom that's been passed down through the generations.
I think that as you're talking it, I was thinking about there'd be some really good art projects too for little kids. Let them draw and like retell the story once you tell them it, let them express. That would be a really good teaching and artistic kind of outlet for them. It's something else you said I wanted to comment on. Oh, are there, this is across cultures. Everyone has the fairy tales or folk tales. And so I think it's really interesting. I have read some African folk tales and some Slavic and of course Celtic, and those reoccurring archetypes and themes, but across any of them have, from not the retellings now, but have you come across any women writers, or do the original ones seem to have been written by men?
That's a great question. Yeah. So, we've got the huge collection of work from the Brothers Grimm, right? But they collected a lot of their stories from women.
Okay.
So the women told them the stories, they wrote them down, they made their own modifications. I like to often go to their earliest printings because I think those are hopefully the closest to the stories they were told. So they did kind of commandeer these stories from women. You're right, because it was men mostly had access to publishing and the time and the resources to write things down. So yeah, but they did get a lot of stories from women, from older women especially. Yeah. the
Yeah, that's what I was
spinstresses.
wondering. Because I know there were movements through history where, it was, they discounted not just art, but especially like female driven stories or women telling, even in novels, as women couldn't get their stories out or get them published or
Yeah.
whatever. So it's interesting from that perspective. And so we can wrap up. I think you were kind of talking about why we shouldn't just, as some critics would suggest, toss these stories aside
Yeah.
and just, create all new ones. And I think you were already showing us the value
Yeah.
of, and how they serve us and
Yeah.
what wisdom we can gain from keeping them. But is there an overlap between fairy tales and mystical teachings in a more traditional sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of metaphors that are in fairy tales, we also see show up in different mystical traditions. So I already mentioned the crown of thorns, and roses. Mother Mary, the Virgin Mary, is really strongly associated with roses. So there are some Christian themes here, and that might have been because of the time that the story was recorded, the little briar rose, where those come in. But I also recently encountered a Sufi. I've been reading a lot of Sufi stories and poetry, and came across a Sufi story of angels fighting over coins of silver and gold, and someone asking them, why angels aren't greedy? Angels don't care about these things. Why are you doing that? And the angel said, well, the silver coins came from the tears of this incredibly devoted person. She was so much longing for God that she was crying tears of silver, and her sighs of longing were creating coins of gold. And I've come across a story called The Goose Girl in the Well, or in the Spring. Depends which title you're going with. And it's a little princess that when she cries, and her tears are those of longing and love, when she cries pearls and jewels. So you start to find these little metaphors, or really big, beautiful metaphors, in mystical metaphor and in the fairy tales. It's really fun.
Then that might bring me to my last question, which is where can we find new fairy tales, or where do you find new fairy tales?
Yeah, so I definitely connect with, as I can, with other storytellers. There's lots of different storytelling groups and centers, and they're doing a lot more online now. So you can go and listen to oral storytelling, which is brilliant. And there also are different repository, like different websites that have these listings of one of them. And maybe what I can do is just get you the link, because it's through university. And I can get you the link. It has basically every fairy tale under the sun, and it orders them by tale type. So if you want to read a whole bunch of different versions of Sleeping Beauty from different countries and different parts of the world, you can look up the tale type of Sleeping Beauty and read those. So that's what, and there's different books that do the same thing, where they have collections of, here are all the stories about that are similar to, or in the theme of Little Red Riding Hood or Cinderella. So it's rabbit holes. You go down one, you find another. But yeah, I can get you the link to that main. It's an amazing free resource on fairy tales. It's just fun just to start digging through. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And as a fiction writer and reader, I'm sure if we stop to think about it, because sometimes you get so wrapped up in the story that, it's hard to analyze it while you're reading it. But if we look at a lot of just modern storytelling, even in movies, or I'm sure we're going to pick up these same fairy tales, running through them in certain ways. So that's another fun kind of exercise for anyone interested in finding the fairy tales and then analyzing them in some of the ways that you were talking about and what it means.
Yeah.
Well, Stacey, I think we're almost out of time, but I do want to mention to anyone listening in, if you think of a comment or question after the fact, or if you're listening in later,
Yeah.
please post them because I will make sure that Stacey sees them. I want to encourage everyone, Stacey, to check out your website, which is listed under the video, but I'll give you a second to tell people what it is as well. But I just want to point out that I find your website fascinating, and being on your newsletter mailing list, you just have so many wonderful resources available and so many offerings that are like this. They're really intriguing and unique, and I find them so fascinating, and I know that others will as well. So I just want to encourage people to do that. And so I want to thank you again so much for joining us. And hopefully you'll come back again because there's still so many interesting topics we can dive into.
Yes,
So before we
absolutely.
do go, will you let people know how to reach you?
Yeah. So my website is wildgratitude.com. Yeah.
Okay. So again, I encourage everyone to check that out and get on Stacey's newsletter list because it is really interesting. So I want to thank everyone who is joining in now or later. And please post those comments. We really appreciate it if you do, and the questions as well. So thank you, everyone. Soul Creativity is going to be on just a brief hiatus. So keep checking back on the channel, and there will be more exciting guests coming up soon. So bye, everyone, and thank you, Stacey.
Yeah. Thank you.